Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, a constitutional crisis in the making. Kenya's Chief Justice's recommendation that Parliament be dissolved because there aren't the constitutionally required number of female lawmakers has sparked fierce opposition, support, and extensive legal wrangling. We take a closer look. Also, tourism workers in Uganda are hoping to make up for lost time now that international travellers are being allowed back in the country. Borders had been closed since March, effectively shutting down the vital industry. And critics of a controversial book on the period after the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis have criticised its French publishers. Author Judy Reaver accuses current President Paul Kagame of having links to the mass killings of Hutus following the 1994 atrocities. But first, the issue of gender equality is at risk of sparking a constitutional crisis in Kenya. Earlier this week, the country's Chief Justice recommended that the president dissolve parliament because there are not the constitutionally required minimum number of female lawmakers. The move would trigger new parliamentary polls, which would be a gamble for President Uhuru Kenyatta. Many male MPs are opposed to dissolution, and legal opinions on the Chief Justice's recommendations are divided as to whether Kenyatta is compelled to comply. The Federation of Women Lawyers held a march on Wednesday in support of the Chief Justice's push for gender parity. According to the Constitution, female MPs should occupy at least a third of parliamentary seats. Currently, only 22% of seats in the lower house and 31% in the upper house are held by women. Mkolwa Shashwayu tells us more.
The Chief Justice of Kenya has called for the dissolution of Parliament. He says it's because it has failed to enact a constitutional rule that says no more than 2/3 of an elected or an appointed body can be of the same gender. The rule was part of the new constitution introduced in 2010. It was intended to give women better representation. 1 out of 5 seats in Kenya's parliament belong to women, and less than a third of the seats in the upper house, also known as the Senate, belong to women. Now, various courts since 2012 have ruled that this rule needs to be enforced. However, it has not happened. So this week, the Chief Justice wrote to President Uhuru Kenyatta, telling him that the parliament has acted against the constitution and therefore needs to be dissolved. Human rights campaigner Doreen Areri has said that the gender imbalance in Kenya's parliament has been harmful to the rights of women.
The framers intended that women would form part of the representation and part of the legislative making body so that we would ensure that these expectations of women would be met and that their well-being would be taken care of. It cannot be that we continue to leave legislation regarding the well-being and the rights of women in the hands of men.
The Speaker of Parliament has disputed the interpretation of the Constitution. He says that Parliament is not required to enforce the 2/3 gender rule. He also says that enacting it at this point would be very expensive. Women's rights activists have said these are just excuses and that Parliament actually lacks the political will to fairly represent women.
Mkolwa Shashwayu there for us. Now, faced with increasingly frequent militant attacks, Mozambique has asked the European Union for help in training its armed forces to tackle the insurgency. Extremists aligned with the Islamic State group have been ramping up violence in the Cabo Delgado province this year. Militia have held the key port of Mocimboa da Praia for 6 weeks, and clashes with government forces have forced over 300,000 people from the province. More than 1,500 have been killed in the conflict since 2017, and the World Food Programme's warned of a deepening humanitarian crisis in the area. At least 28 people were killed in a tanker explosion in the central Nigerian state of Kogi on Wednesday. A truck carrying petrol overturned at the state capital of Lokoja after the brakes failed and the driver lost control. Several vehicles were burned in the blaze that erupted, including a bus carrying students. In Praise of Blood, a controversial book looking at the period after the 1994 Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis, came out in English in 2018. Now, the author, Canadian journalist Judy Reaver, accuses Rwandan President Paul Kagame of having committed mass crimes against Hutus following the mass killings. Discussion regarding the genocide is particularly sensitive here in France, where the book has only now come out. Some organisations here had called on the publisher not to move forward with the book. Nicolas Chemin has more.
Rwanda in Praise of Blood is a book that makes some very strong accusations against Paul Kagame. Canadian journalist Judy Reaver does not deny the genocide of the Tutsis took place in 1994. But she says that after that tragedy, Kagame's RPF, or Rwandan Patriotic Front, committed mass crimes against Hutus. She believes these crimes could constitute a genocide.
Les sources pour ce livre sont des victimes Hutus au Rwanda, ailleurs en Afrique, dans d'autres pays, et en exil dans l'Occident. Après ça, j'ai basé en fait la recherche sur tous les crimes du FPR, sur des nombreuses interviews avec des acteurs du FPR, des soldats et des officiers. Ce sont des Tutsis.
1 month before the book was published in French, several NGOs wrote an open letter in the newspaper Libération. Among them was Ibuka, which defends survivors of the Tutsi genocide. They say the investigation is full of lies.
Un livre qui propage et qui cherche à diffuser une parole qui remet en cause les explications, le déroulement et la nature du génocide contre les Tutsis qui a été perpétré en 1994. Donc c'est un livre qui se fonde sur des interprétations mensongères qui reprennent la parole des génocidaires afin de remettre en cause donc la nature même du crime commis en 1994.
Reaver's book is being published just a few days before the 10th anniversary of the UN's mapping report. The mapping document also denounced mass crimes committed by Rwandan forces against Hutus in Congo. Congolese Nobel Peace Prize winner Denis Mukwege has repeatedly said this report should not be buried, but the chapter containing the list of possible war criminals has never been made public.
Now, Uganda has reopened to international visitors who have certificates proving that they've recently tested negative for COVID-19. The country's borders had been closed since March 30th, and tourism has been hit pretty hard. The industry is now eager to try and recoup its losses. Erin Ogunke has more.
In the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, it's an all too common story for countries dependent on foreign visitors. Coronavirus restrictions and fears about traveling have devastated tourism industries, including here in Uganda. Between 2018 and 2019, tourism brought $1.4 billion into the Ugandan economy, accounting for over 7% of the country's GDP. And while 1.4 million people visited the country in 2019, that number fell to zero between March and June of this year, according to the Uganda Tourism Board.
We were forced to close. Of course, everyone did, but on our side it was quite difficult. We had to look for the ways to pay off our workers and pay the rent for the office.
Prior to the health crisis, his company employed 7 permanent staff members, all of whom have now been laid off. The government's decision to reopen its borders on October 1st, however, has many hoping for a swift comeback. Tourism operators are encouraging visitors not to cancel their bookings, while the country looks for solutions to safely accommodate them.
We are looking at what other people are doing in other countries, and many of them are looking at, if you are able to come with a certificate that shows you were tested recently, then you do a quick test, and 1-2 days later, it is determined whether you're positive or not, and then you're allowed to proceed to wherever you're going.
Earlier this month, the European Union also pledged to provide a grant as well as a loan to Uganda's tourism industry to the tune of some 14 million euros.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.